Simon, thank you for joining me today on the Hungry Celluloid podcast show. Could you possibly give a short introduction about who you are?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me.
My
It's nice
pleasure.
to know that people still know that I exist. Um, so my name is Simon Kurt Unsworth, and I am a horribly middle-aged these days writer of. For a long time, have described it as essentially grumpy fiction. And I've been doing that on and off published for nearly 20 years, but I've kind of been writing all of my life. In practical terms, I am a local authority worker. I do sort of heritage stuff and event stuff, and I live in the Lake District in the UK. And my favourite thing in pretty much the whole world at the moment is to swim in lakes, but not ones that are full of shit from the water companies. I like to find lakes that are clean and swim in them and sort of find some peace and serenity doing that. So that's me. I'm a father. I'm a pet owner. I'm often confused by the state of the world. But like most of us, I suspect.
I
And that's about all that's worth saying about me, I think, at this point.
Thanks, Simon. You said you're in the Lake District, so I'd like to ask you about. Were you born in the Lake District?
No, I was born in Manchester. And for years and years and years, I used to write in the little biogs that I used to have to write for when I had a story in an anthology. I have been looking all the time for the sort of signs and portents the night I was born that something exciting had happened, but there's nothing. But I discovered actually the night I was born on 14th of February 1972, because I am old, there were power cuts across the whole of Manchester. So I was
Mm.
born in Wythenshawe and there were power cuts all around. So I like to think that was kind of my fault. But I'm a Mancunian by birth. I was there till I went to university, and then I went back, and then I sort of got married a number of years later and ended up in Lancaster. The Lakes is a sort of the last 9 years.
Hmm.
No, 13, 14 years now. We've been in the Lakes. And it's great. It's nice to be in a place that's this beautiful and this majestic, but also, like I say, has lakes for me to swim in, which is a nice thing.
Are you in Kendal? Is that correct?
Yeah. I'm in the gateway to the lakes town, and part of my job is to talk about Kendal to groups of people and individuals. So I do talks about the history of Kendal and where Kendal comes from and why it is the way it is. And that's it's kind of quite nice to know a place that well, because I never knew Manchester that well, but my job has forced me to learn about Kendal, which is good.
When you were in Manchester, how much of that do you think contributed to you becoming a writer? I mean, I know we can say that everything contributes to a person becoming a writer, but how much of that has played into your fiction?
Manchester, I'm not I mean, like you say, you can't escape your roots. So clearly, a lot of the influences. I mean, my sort of growing up in Manchester and going out clubbing in Manchester, all of those things make you the person that you are. Um, but I think the bigger influence actually was when I moved to Lancaster. I was working. I worked in Liverpool, so I commuted a lot on the trains, and it was a very long and quite an arduous train journey that it ultimately ended up affecting my mental health. And
Mhm.
I had to do something with that time. And what I did with the time was to go back to something I had been doing as a kid but hadn't really done since then, which was writing. So actually a bigger influence, I think, is kind of Lancashire and to some extent Liverpool, and that time between the two when I was in this liminal space of really horrible train journeys that were just awful and needing to use the time. So you sit there and you go, well, if I'm on a train, I might as well write a story about the train journey from hell. And I have written a number of stories about trains, and I can see that that's exactly where that comes from. And a lot of I started to write a lot of place specific stuff. So a lot of that was Lancashire. There are some Manchester ones in there. There's at least one or two stories that are set in places that I remember very clearly from Manchester. But most of it's Lancashire, Cheshire, and to some extent now Cumbria.
Which part of Liverpool were you in? Were you in Central or in
Oh,
one of the districts?
I was in the centre. I worked for the
Okay.
council there. I'm a long-term local government worker.
Yeah.
So I used to kind of be middle management. So I was right in the centre. My office was sort of right in the middle. I covered the whole of Liverpool, so I would go out to various places.
Hmm.
But most of the time I would come into Lime Street and walk to the office, and then dread getting the train home because it was always horrible.
I'm going to ask you something about this train because I knew beforehand that you wrote on trains at the beginning. Um, we're almost exactly the same age. I'm just 1 year older than you, so
Okay.
we grew up in the same time. But what are your memories of the times, the attitudes, the politics, the music, the fashion, the way that people behave? Maybe even quite interestingly, the way that people view gender then, even though nobody was using such a word as gender.
Mm. I mean, my memory of sort of growing up, and I suspect this isn't particularly Manchester specific, is that it was a time of real stress and real change. But then I think all times are if you live through them, particularly when you're trying to
Mhm.
find your own identity. I remember all the Clause 28 stuff. I remember
Yeah,
feeling, really quite the poll tax stuff and the poll
yeah,
tax riots. And I remember being very angry that I got up one morning and my mum had paid my poll tax for me just after I'd become a student, and I was sort of not paying it as a kind of it was the only piece of civil disobedience I've ever really done.
yeah, yeah.
But what I remember actually most is that when I found a group of friends who thankfully I'm still friendly with today, and we started going out to, there was a club called the Banshee, and then there was the Ritz, which is still there on a
Hmm.
Monday night. And I was a goth, and
Yeah, yeah,
my mates were all goths. And what I remember is finding a community that was just completely all inclusive. It
yeah,
didn't matter if you were gay, it didn't matter if you were bi, it didn't matter if you, as long as you went in and had a laugh and danced to the Sisters of Mercy, no
yeah,
one gave a shit what you looked like. The difficulty was always getting from home to the Banshee when you had to go through the groups of, Stone Roses fans and Smiths
yeah,
fans who hated goths, and football fans who thought you were queer because you wore nail varnish, which I'm still
yeah,
doing to this day.
yeah.
But I never actually had any major trouble. It was just there was always a sort of a slight amount of tension. But I would imagine it's the same for teenagers today. There are just different tensions. And I think that is because as you grow up and as you find yourself, I'm absolutely comfortable now in who I am. But at 18, you haven't got, well, I hadn't got a clue. Well, maybe some 18-year-olds are lucky enough to know exactly who they are. But I didn't know that. I was still working all of that out. And finding that community with my friends sort of Glyn and Nyan and Karen and Steve and a whole bunch of other people was really something important to me, was that sense that actually I could belong somewhere, even in a time when what I looked like didn't fit the mainstream, where what I listened
Hmm.
to didn't necessarily fit the mainstream. But then the Sisters of Mercy made it into the top 20 or the top 10 or whatever it was, and it was like, you see,
Yeah,
we've told you, you have to come with us because we're leading the pack, sort of thing.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but I do remember. I mean, I remember sort of the wider political. Thatcher. Jesus Christ, what a nightmare! And I look back at that and I think it's dreadful, the kind of the long-term fallout of that political environment. And
Yeah.
you do what you can to kind of to rage back against that, but the damage feels like it's been done now, really.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely generational from those times. Yeah.
But I have faith and I have hope. My son is 21, and he sees the world in a very different way, and I think I look at the world in quite a decent way. My son sees it in a different way to me, and he sees it in a much, again, broader and more all encompassing way than I do. So I think, there's a lot of tensions and swings going on at the moment between the kind of the right and the left, small r and small l, not necessarily even politically. But I think ultimately that notion that we are all one group of people trying our best, I think that will win out, or at least I hope that will win out. And I have faith when I look at Ben and his friends that that's where they all come from and that's where they all go to. So that if they are the driving force of the next generations, then we're not in that bad a set of hands, hopefully.
Yeah, that's my view of it as well. We're quite similar in a way because I used to hang out with my goth friends. I was more grunge, but it didn't really matter who you were. My friends were heavy metal and goths, and we went
Yeah,
to all the clubs in Liverpool. Liverpool was my city at the time. But I remember that my mum saying to me early on, because I grew up in a provincial village just out 10 minutes away from Liverpool, avoid places. I won't name the place, but it's a town nearby to where I grew up, and she said just avoid it. It's a gauntlet of what you've just explained. If you dress
yeah,
differently, you look differently, there's a chance you're going to get a beating on a Friday
yeah,
or
yeah,
Saturday night. So I bypassed that after a very short period of time, and I spent most of my time in Liverpool. The only problem for me in Liverpool was everybody was fantastic. Didn't matter if they were trendies or not. It was trying to get home to the village, so I had to sleep in Lime Street Station on the seats. And
yeah,
every 5 minutes, there was a police officer booting your feet, trying to wake you up and say, "Not here, lads, not here." But
yeah.
I remember those times, and I remember the politics. I remember the poll tax. They called them riots, but that's just a response from the people. I remember all of that very clearly. And just like you, I tried to do my little bit, perhaps not very much. But I want to go back to this thing about trains and why was the train journey so bad? Was it just the distance, or was it the people
No,
on the train?
no, no. I started that job not long after the Hatfield rail crash.
Okay.
When they realised because of that crash, they realised how poorly the infrastructure had been maintained.
Hmm.
So certainly the first 9 months to a year of doing my job in Liverpool, there was not a week went by when I wasn't delayed by, an hour. Sometimes I just never even made it in because there would be cancellations, things would run
Mm.
slow because they were
Mm.
upgrading track. And it was hard work. I was getting up at, um, I was getting up at 6 o'clock to get a train at sort of 10 to 7 at the local, sort of the nearest station, which was a sort of 20-minute walk. So I was getting there, particularly in winter, I was getting there in the dark and it was freezing cold and I'd get in the dark and then I'd get the train. And if I was lucky, I'd get to work on time, but very often I was late and I would have to explain myself. And then the same would happen on the way home. Sometimes I would be home before it got dark again, but usually I'd get home in the dark. And I remember not seeing daylight in Lancaster for weeks at a time over winter.
Hmm.
Um, and within that, but then there'd be days where, like I say, you'd look up and it'd say cancellation. You'd think, oh great, or it'd say delayed, and you were always okay if it said delayed by, and then there was a time. If it just said the word delayed, you knew you were in for a long wait, and that was the bit that was hard because before I started writing on the trains, though I would just sit on the platform on the train, being delayed, knowing I was going to get late, knowing I was going to get bollocked, knowing there was like meetings I was missing, and being stressed about it. And what writing did was allow me to almost think, "Oh, I'm delayed. Fantastic! I've got an extra half an hour to put another chapter in, to kill one more character off or whatever." So the period before I started writing, the period when I was on trains and they were in this really difficult state. It's that sense of being very out of control,
Hmm.
that you're not under your own steam. You're literally waiting for someone else to pull a lever, to push a button, to move the train forward, to open up a slot in the stations that you can get off. I remember being sat on a train outside Lancaster, waiting for it to go in because we'd missed our platform slot, and I was friends with a guy called Andy, and Andy was looking out the window of the train down the slope at his wife sitting in the garden drinking a glass of wine, and he didn't get home for another hour. And that was kind of what it felt like, sense that life was going on outside the window while we were trapped because of the underinvestment. And that made that a very difficult year. But like I say, once I started writing, those delays were great. I'd just get in my headphones and I'd start tapping
Hmm.
away.
Yeah.
And 3 hours later, it's supposed to be a 2.5 hour journey. Sometimes it'd take 4 hours, sometimes it'd take 4.5. And that was just more time to put chapters in, like I say, to put people through situations and to work out the plot. So you sort of tried to find a way of turning it to my advantage, and it seems to have worked.
And did anyone ever ask you on the train what you were doing?
Sometimes, yeah, you make train friendships, but most of the time, I mean, I know writers who have to have absolute silence to write in,
Yeah.
and I'm not one of them. I actually find it very difficult to write in silence, and that's because I learnt to write on a train that was noisy. So I then learned to write listening to music, because
Hmm.
that was a way of blocking out the rest of the world, blocking out the people's conversations around me.
Yeah.
And it was a good way of, particularly when I was feeling antisocial, it meant I didn't have to talk to people. Um,
Yeah.
Sometimes it was quite nice to have a conversation, and sometimes people, did talk. And I used to write on a little Scion Series 5, which was battery operated, and if I ran out of batteries, I would have to then come out of it and talk. But most of the time, I would literally, I once I got an iPod in particular, I'd put my iPod on shuffle and I'd climb inside it, and I would just be music and writing, and I didn't really care what the world was doing around me. And that got to be quite a nice place to be, and it's still quite a nice place to be today. I still like that writing environment that I can create for myself, where actually the whole world can just cock off because I'm just being in my happy place.
What about when you moved to Kendal? Because it's a vastly different environment to the one that you were familiar with beforehand. I mean, I know Kendal. I've been to Kendal a few times, but it was a long time ago. I have friends in the Lake District as well who retired there. So it's a beautiful part of the world, but it is very different than Manchester and Liverpool.
Yeah.
How did that? Is it a bubble for you, Kendal, compared to the rest of the country?
No, it's not a bubble because I still get out of it. What Kendall came around because I did that terrible thing. I got married and I had a child, and I was living in Lancaster. So Lancaster isn't much bigger than Kendal. It's a bit bigger, but it was much smaller than Manchester, and I much preferred that. I much preferred the kind of the slightly easier going vibe to a smaller town. But in the sort of early 2000s, like it was what, 2013, I separated, and I did that terrible thing where I colonized my parents' spare room for a year while I tried to work out what my life looked like.
Hmm.
And then I met someone, and we started sort of going out, we started dating, we got together. And she was in Cheshire, so I was splitting my time between Cheshire and Manchester. And then for various reasons we decided we wanted to move, and both of us just always wanted to be in the Lake District. So
Hmm.
we just sort of said, well, if we're going to move anyway, now's the time to do it. And we didn't actually move to Kendal straight away. We moved to a tiny farming village called Sedba, and Sedba was an experience. Sedba is a town where if you kick one person, every one of them starts limping. And that made it quite a nice place to be for a while, and then quite a not nice place to be for a while.
Hmm.
So Kendal feels like the best of all worlds. It's big enough to have all the things that we need sort of on the doorstep,
Yeah.
but it's small enough to feel like a town rather than a city. And it's not a village. It's bigger than a village, but it has that sense of I can walk down the street now, particularly because of the job that I do. I sort of know people, and that's a bit of a first for me. Over this last few years is being you're walking down the street and kind of people actually going, "Hello, Simon," and in Manchester that didn't really happen.
Yeah.
So Kendal, and it being on the doorway to the lakes kind of thing, means it's half an hour drive from Ambleside and the lake that I like to swim in, and it's a bit further away from some of the bigger lakes, and days out in town. So it's kind of a nice place to be, and it's a place I think you never say never, do you? You don't know what the opportunities are going to be, but I'm certainly here for the foreseeable future. And I like it as a town. I like its history, and I like the environment of it. And it's in an increasingly politically unpleasant environment. Kendal remains generally staunchly liberal, which is
Hmm.
really, really good. Um, so yeah.
Okay, Simon. So we're into the second part of the podcast, and this is the part where I ask all the writers and guests to tell me something about writing the books, the fiction. I'd like to go back and ask you about when you were writing on the trains and you started to write for the first time. Um, how long was it before you were writing your first story on a train to actually submitting it?
Um, so I started writing on trains in probably late 2001. I'd always written. and I had submitted stuff before then. I remember I'd had a rejection from Interzone in
Oh
the
yeah.
mid-90s.
Yeah.
And looking back, it it was a rejection that was asking me to redo and resubmit because it had a handwritten critique attached to it.
Hmm.
And I just took that as, oh, well, they hate it, so I'm not going to bother. So I'd always done bits here and there and made an effort, made attempts, and I would do some, I'd stop and do some and stop. And but 2001 on the trains was the first time, excuse me, that it was a serious effort and it was a daily thing. But the very first thing I did was I wrote a novel. I wrote a very bad novel, but that had enough in it to make me think that I could do better. So at that point, that novel took me most of my time in Liverpool. I only actually worked in Liverpool for about 3 years. And what happened then was that I got a job in Lancashire, much closer to home, which gave me the time to join a writers group, actually to join creative writing classes to learn how to do what I wanted to do better. And as a consequence of that, I then managed to get a story published in 2006, I think it was. Um, so it was sort of roughly 5 years of writing for my own enjoyment, but also writing and hoping that people would like it. And enough people liked bits of the novel and told me they liked bits of the novel for me to think it had legs and that the writing had legs. But about 5 years, and that was a publication for an online BBC thing. The first story I had published or I had accepted in a traditionally published anthology was accepted in 2007. Came out in 2007. Although, to be fair, I'd submitted it in 2005. They were just a very, very, very slow sort of decision-making process involved. So we're looking at about 5 years, I would say, sort of 4 or 5 years of learning how to do what I wanted to do, and then it being good enough to actually show people.
Do you remember the first? Do you remember which anthology it was?
Oh yeah, the online BBC one was a thing called A Passion for the Art of Taxidermy,
Hmm.
which was edited by Muriel Gray.
Oh
And
wow.
it was part of I don't think they do it anymore, but the BBC used to do an online thing called Get Writing.
Hmm.
And there was just an open call, and I found out later that Alison Littlewood was also one of the
Oh wow.
successful contributors. The first one I was in as a tree book was an Ash Tree anthology called At Ease with the Dead, and it was my story Church on the Island that I'd sent them, and that had been written again on trains as a result of a really rather pleasant holiday I took. And I'd submitted it, but it took them about a year and a half because Ash Tree were always notoriously slow at kind of making
I
decisions.
remember. Yeah.
Um, but they liked it, they took it, they made it the opening story of At Ease with the Dead, and that was I sort of still see that as the starting point of my writing career because it was the first time something was out in the wider world in bookshops and websites that had my name attached to it. And so that I will always be grateful to Ash Tree, to Barbara and Chris at Ash Tree for sort of reading that story and liking it enough to making it their opening story, and then to Steve Jones for liking it and taking it for best new horror. But that was 6 years. I think 6 years between me starting to write and it appearing in paper and my being sent a contributor copy through the post kind of thing.
But that short story particularly though, I mean, did that lead to Barbara and Chris Roden off because it's Lost Place? Is it in Lost Places?
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
It's the last story in Lost Places.
it is, yeah.
Um,
And it was nominated though, wasn't it? I mean, it was nominated for was it a World Fantasy Award?
yeah, it was. It was taken for. Steve Jones selected it for best new horror of the year that year.
Hmm.
It was nominated for a World Fantasy Award. And then a couple of years later, Steve Jones selected it as the story from the year. He did a sort of the very best of best new horror, which was
Hmm.
one story from each of the. At that point, it was 20 years, and he selected Church on the Island was from the 19th year. So it's a story, and then it got translated into French. Lost Places is currently being translated into Spanish. So it's a
Wow.
story that had real legs, and it is literally a story. The story behind the story is one I've always been quite enjoyed, because it seems to sum up writing for me, which is that I went on holiday, and on the transfer coach between the airport and the hotel, went to Greece, and there was a little. We were sort of going along the side of a bay, and there was a little island out in the bay, and it had on one building on it. It was
Hmm.
a little blue and white traditional Greek church, and all around me on the coach, I could hear people going, "Isn't it beautiful? We could get married there. Wouldn't it be lovely to go to a service there?" And all that kind of thing. And all I could think was, well, when the end of the world starts, it'll start in a building just like that. Because I was on holiday, I hadn't taken a pen, I hadn't taken paper, I hadn't taken anything, because my plan was to, drink wine and sunbathe and swim.
Hmm.
So I spent the first week of the holiday wanting to write this story with no way of writing, because I don't like writing on my phone. And I think if I remember right, in my time, my phone was very basic. But nowhere was selling notebooks. And it took a week to find a shop up in the hills of. I hired a car, and we were just out in the middle of nowhere. And I found a shop that finally sold and had a notebook that I could buy. And I spent the next week waking up early and going and writing this story, longhand. And it's become something of a tradition for me now, is that whenever I go on holiday, I take a notebook and a pen and I try and write something longhand. And I don't normally do that. Normally I just type straight into my iPad or my computer. But that always felt like that's the point at which I switched from being someone who was writing to being a writer, because suddenly the story wouldn't let itself not be written, which I realise sounds really pretentious and arsey, but it's absolutely true. It was like it was itching in my head, and I had
Hmm.
to get it out somehow. And so that was the result of that. And then, people seem to like it. It's been, it's had accolades and, award nominations. I mean, thank Christ it didn't win. The first published story to have won a World Fantasy Award, I would never have got over it, I don't think. I'd have had a head the size of a, watermelon farm, and I'd have been banging into doorways walking through them. And I'm sort of always chasing that slight high of a story that good again. And it's
Hmm.
happened a
Hmm.
couple of times that I've written something that I was equally proud. I mean, I'm proud of everything I've written, but I am enormously proud of what that story gave me and where it came from. So, it's a nice thing to have done.
Do you remember the day when you learned that you had been nominated?
I do, actually. I was, again, the holidays seem to form a big part of these stories, don't they? I was on a break. It wasn't a holiday, it was a break. I was in Edinburgh, for a long weekend break with my ex-wife on our anniversary. And I woke up to an email, or I woke up to a couple of emails, one from the Rodens at Ashtree saying, You're going to get an email in a few minutes that's important, read it." And then the second email was from the nominations committee saying, "We're pleased to tell you you've been nominated." So I was lying, faintly hungover, in a hotel in Edinburgh, um, and reading this email with a sort of slight sense of dislocation, and not being sure
Mm.
that it was actually real, and then trying to explain to my ex what it was, why I was sat like grinning like a lunatic. Yeah, so my ex was trying to talk to me about plans for the day and what we might do, and I was just sat in the bed, so grinning like a lunatic, thinking I've just been nominated for a World Fantasy Award. A thing that I didn't. I woke up to the email saying, or I suspect I did, but only in a kind of very loose way. And having never thought that I would be a part of that, to suddenly be nominated, to suddenly have a story that, like, the month after that I knew was due to be published in Best New Horror, was really kind of like, it was a really special time, and it was a story that I remain enormously proud of. Partly for the story itself, and partly for how it got written, but partly for all the doors it opened for me, because it has opened an awful lot of doors on the back of one 7,000 word story about the beginning of the end of the world.
Um, what year was that, Sam?
Published in 2007. So the nomination was 2000, was for the awards were 2008 for the 2007 publications.
I remember everyone talking about it on the Ramsey Campbell message board. I remember it vaguely that time when it happened. Yeah, that was a big thing. I remember out of all the writers who were talking on the Ramsey Campbell message board, I remember people congratulating you and stuff. I think everybody was thinking, "Wow, that's amazing."
Yeah, and it was amazing, you know, and I don't mean it in the sense of to sort of be big myself up, but it was amazing for this unknown to
Yeah,
you know write a story that Ash Tree picked and made it the opening story of their anthology. That then it just gathered momentum. You know, and I still don't quite understand why. I mean, you know, I can see without sounding boastful, I can see that it's a good story.
it
But
is a good story. It's an excellent story.
what I'd done was I'd obviously tapped into some kind of zeitgeist. Maybe people liked the idea. Maybe it was just the right time for old Greek priests
Hmm.
and pretty women starting the end of the world. I just don't know what it was about it that everyone reacted to so positively. But I'm just enormously grateful that they did.
And how long was it before you had? How long was it before this collection was published? Was this your first collection?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, it was.
That was
Yeah.
it was 2010. But the reason there was such a gap was I was due to do a collection with a company prior to that, but they turned out to be um, not very good. I will leave it at that.
Okay.
If anyone's listening to this who was around at that time, remembers the name Ghostwriter, they will remember them well. So I was due to have something out in around 2008, and I was sort of growing increasingly concerned with the way this company was acting and the sort of the mood music I was getting from them.
Hmm.
So I again what I did was I was enormously lucky. I went back to the Rodens and I asked them to look at the contract that I'd signed, and they were kind enough to give me some advice on the contract, which was really not a very good contract.
Hmm.
And at the same time, um, they hadn't done much for a while, and they were looking to do something for World Horror, which was going to be in Brighton that year. So they came back to me and said, well, look, if I did decide not to go with Ghostwriter, they would be interested in putting something together. um and by that point I had written enough stories to sort of form the collection that became Lost Places. So again, I most of my life has been spent not planning anything and just stepping into really lucky breaks. And I remember at the time a lot of people going, "How did you get an ash tree collection?" Well, I suspect it's because I sent Barbara and Chris an email on the day they were thinking about collections, and I've been incredibly lucky and incredibly, you know, the sort of coincidences have always played a big part of my sort of writing career, and I'll take that as long as it keeps happening to me, I think.
Yeah. I'd like to talk to you though. You've written quite a number of books. You've written Quiet Houses. The title "Diseases of the Teeth" is my favorite. That's a fantastic title. You've also written Lost Places, Strange Gateways, but then you've also got two novels, The Devil Detective and The Devil's Evidence. Um, was there a big jump from writing short stories to novels? I know that's a question that writers often get asked, but I'm genuinely interested in whether there was a big change for you in how you wrote.
Well, I mean, yeah, yes, in some senses. Um, but no, in others. And I'd say that because Quiet Houses, for those of you who haven't read it, and if you haven't, you know, why not? But Quiet Houses is the first time
Tia.
I tried a longer piece of fiction. It's seven short stories, but it's a portmanteau. So although they're all
Yeah.
capable of being read individually, they do form a bigger narrative. Um, and I the vagaries of publishing meant that Strange Gateways was the second collection I had accepted.
Hmm.
So I then wrote I'd done Strange Gateways and it was all just being processed. I then wrote Quiet Houses, which came out before Strange Gateways. And because I'd done this connected narrative, and each short story had been written as a short story, and they were all written bar one, especially for that collection. They were all written with the larger narrative in mind, even though you can literally read any one of them without having read the connective tissue and the other stories.
Yeah.
And I just felt like it was time to. I'd been toying with. I'd written a novel already, as I said before.
Yeah, I
It turned
remember.
out to
Yeah.
not be very good, and I was umming and ahhing about going back and rewriting that because I still liked the story. Um, but then I'd also had a story, a version, a notion or an idea in my head for as long as I could remember, back from when I was about, Christ, I must have been about 22, and I was in my then girlfriend's flat in Leeds, and I looked out the window and I saw in the road um, an old-fashioned train going down the road on fire with people behind all the windows on fire. And I'd always wondered what that was because I knew instinctively that the train was in hell. So I had this idea of something happening in a very odd version of hell. So I went to my best mate and I said, which of these should I write? And he went, oh, write the hell one. It's much more interesting. And that's what I did. I went away and I tried to work out, what was the actual story? Was it, was it a ghost story? Was it just and it turned out to be a police procedural thriller, but set in a very idiosyncratic version of hell, one that you don't necessarily recognise. So, um, and it was a tough gig. It took me. I say tough gig. It's not like being a miner or a brain surgeon. It's not actually
Yeah,
hard,
yeah, I
but
understand.
it took a bit of concentration to write in a longer form. The temptation was always to kind of close things down very quickly, and actually, in a novel, you've got a chance to breathe, and you have got a chance to put in, things like subplots and subtext and ideas that are not necessarily the main idea, but actually do contribute. So it took me a good year and a half to write and rewrite and edit it down to a version that I was happy with, that my then my still my agent was happy to start sending round. And so it was and in that period, I didn't write any short stories, and that was the big change for me because I'd never,
Hmm.
since starting writing, I was writing, particularly early on, I was sometimes writing 2 short stories a week. So to suddenly not write, and even Quiet Houses was short stories. So to not write any short stories, to be concentrating on this one world and this one person or a set of people, but one main person within this one world that I was creating, was the big change, I think.
Did you have any influences in mind when you were writing The Devil's
Oh God,
Detective?
yeah. You can't not do. You are the sum of your parts always, and people who say that they're not influenced by anything, I think are fooling themselves. Devil's Detective influences. I can point very clearly to John Carpenter's Escape from New York, and that notion of a place that's collapsing in on itself, but still somehow has an internal structure and a society that functions. And within that, yes, there are awful people, but there are people just trying to live halfway decent lives. I can point you to a whole bunch of 1970s thrillers and giallos, particularly ones set in New York, where there's this sense again that round every corner there is someone who will do you harm, and
Hmm.
that somehow you've got to navigate yourself through this world. And all I did was I took that sense of constantly being on edge and constantly being wary, and I added a bunch of demons to it. And at the heart of it, there is a murder mystery. There is a set of murders occurring, and a guy who wants to, for the first time ever, actually solve a crime in hell because he's not normally allowed. Dark City was an influence.
Oh, great.
David Fincher's Seven. The visuals of David Fincher's Seven were an influence. Um, but then so's every other horror film and thriller that I've ever watched
Yeah,
and
yeah.
written and listened to on audiobook, because all of those teach you how to structure your world. If Devil's Detective works as a thriller, it's because I read P.D. James.
Hmm.
It's because I read Carl Hiaasen. It's because I read, Ed McBain. It's because I read, Christopher Fowler's Bryant and May books.
Oh yeah,
If it works
fantastic.
as a horror novel,
Yeah.
it's because I read Stephen King and M.R. James. And out of all of those things, you take the stuff that works for you and you turn it. You don't copy them necessarily, but
Yeah.
you are influenced by the idea that, if you are solving a crime, it's piece by piece. If you are writing a horror story, it's about tension and atmosphere. So, and it remains to this day. Whatever I write, I write. If I write a story today, it will be influenced by everything that I've experienced, the good things, the bad things. You learn as much from. You read something you don't like, you remember why you don't like it, and as a writer, you then try and not do that in your own stuff. So, but yeah, go and watch Escape. If you watch Escape from New York and then add demons in, you've pretty much got a version of The Devil's Detective, I think.
What about are you a planner or are you
No,
someone who, no. Okay.
absolutely not. No, I normally have one or two key images, and if I'm lucky, I have an idea of where it's going.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
normally, I just start with a central idea. Um, Particularly in novels, there's usually a point somewhere in the middle where I lose complete grip of it, and I have to do two things. I have to reread what I've written and kind of almost make notes of who's doing what and why. And there's a brief notes, there's a sentences just to remind me. And I then think, are there things that I haven't done with it yet? Are there scenes that I haven't managed to fit in? And Devil's Detective, I remember very clearly doing that in Cafe Nero in Lancaster. I literally wrote out, hand wrote a list of things that I still hadn't had. There was a scene on a train that actually didn't make it into the book in the end, but there was that scene on the train I'd not written. There was a fight by a lake that I hadn't quite sorted out, and then worked out roughly what to do. But I never start with that. I start with a central notion, one or two scenes if I'm lucky, and like I say, if I'm really lucky, a vague idea of what direction it's heading and what the ending. And I always knew what the ending of The Devil's Detective was. I always had a very, very clear idea of exactly where it was going to finish, but all of the stuff in the middle, there was nothing. It was just I'll start writing. I'll see where it goes.
And is there a difference in terms of word count for you with a novel and a short story? I suppose there probably is, but maybe there wasn't. Did you always have like a word count for every day that I'm writing a
No,
novel? No.
no, I
No.
don't. I, I, I can sort of see the benefits of that, and sort of forcing yourself to a minimum of 1,000 a day or whatever. But no, because the novel didn't have a home to go to, much like most of my stuff doesn't have homes when I start writing it. I mean, sometimes I've written for commission, and that's brilliant. But I was writing it because I wanted to write it, and yes, I wanted it to be published, and yes, I would loved it to have been a huge hit and made me an absolute fortune. But actually, what I did most of all was I wrote it because it was good fun.
Yeah,
Um,
of course.
there's
Yeah.
something immensely enjoyable about writing a novel in which you collapse the whole world around someone's ears, and then you watch them struggle through it. So I wrote most days because I had the capacity to write most days. I was on trains, I was in my back garden, I, but there was no sense for me of do X amount or do Y amount on a particular day. If I managed 100 words, that was good. If I managed 2,000 words, that was good, as long as I did something.
I have two more questions for you before we
Oh,
take a break and go into the
yeah,
third part. But the thing is, though, with you, you're in that place that a lot of writers don't get to, which is you have an agent. And
I do.
a lot of writers are really desperate to get there, and it doesn't happen for a lot of them. When you got an agent, though, did it put any pressure on you to when you were writing the novel? You're thinking, and I mean, I know you write for the love of it, which is the most important thing. But did you feel pressure because you now had an agent?
I didn't feel pressure. I was very getting an agent for me was an act of again massive luck and massive coincidence, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I was talking to my friend Stephen Volk, and he said, "Why don't you send the 3 chapters of the novel you've written, first 3 chapters, to my agent, there's a guy called John Boleyn, at the Zeno agency?" So I did, and I put a covering note saying, my mate Steve says you should look at these and whatever. And I got a message back from John Boleyn saying, I don't read stuff that isn't finished, because the novel wasn't done at that point. So I don't read stuff that isn't finished. Basically, fuck off and come back to me when it's a completed thing. That's pretty much exactly what he said. Okay, fair enough. I absolutely get that. And I woke up to an email 4 weeks later from John saying, against my better judgment, I read the chapters and I liked them a lot, but there's a lot of things wrong with it. And he laid out some of the things that within that first 3 chapters he didn't like and that he was struggling with. So I then was able to take that on board, rewrite the first 3, and then he did say again, but don't come and speak to me until it's actually done. I don't want to hear from you until it's a finished thing. And that was it. I took on board what he'd said. Most of it made sense. Most of it was good advice. I rewrote the first 3. It didn't take a lot of rewriting. I just needed to add some stuff. And then with all of that support and information in mind, I was able to write the rest of it. And then John was great. I sent it to John, and he came back to me with sort of suggestions and thoughts, because obviously he looks at it more from a commercial perspective in terms of whether it's sellable. And he was like, it was John that said to me, you could up the sort of subplots. Because one thing I think that I got wrong initially was I approached it like a big short story, whereas just one straight linear narrative. And actually what John was sort of said to me was, no, it's more interesting if you've got things spinning off in different directions and you don't know quite how they're going to intersect. So the first version I sent to him ended up being very different, but certainly different. There was a scene that got cut out, quite a big scene, a death that got cut out because he just said there's no point in this. And most of what he told me was right. So I never felt pressure other than the standard pressure I think all writers feel of, that you're going to send your stuff to somebody. And what you want when you send your stuff to somebody is that somebody is going to like it. Yeah. But I didn't really, other than what he'd said about the first 3 chapters, I didn't know what John was looking for. I didn't know, whether I was going to throw this at him and it was going to stick or not. I did what I've always done, which is I wrote on a wing and a prayer, and I had hope. And I was lucky. It connected with John. He then sent it round all of his, and that again was fantastic for me, because slush piles never, it's rare for something to rate off a slush pile, but mine wasn't going in from a slush pile. It was going in from the Xeno agency, who represent a number of very high quality authors. So the editors at the publishing houses were more likely to look at it, and they did. And somewhere I've got an email from John with all the rejections I had from them, but that meant they were at least reading it.
Yeah.
So that was brilliant. Steve Volt giving me the advice to send to John actually taking a chance and reading it, and then the advice that John gave me, all contributed to a book that is far better than the book that I wrote, and it's better as a result of all the feedback that John and then the editors at the publishing houses gave me as well.
So the final question connected to this is, will there be a continuation? Because there's a second book. Will there be a third book? Will you be returning to this?
Never say never, but I'm not on contract for it. So if I do, it would be because I felt like it. I do have a couple of stories that I sort of feel like I need to tell about Fool, but I'm not doing anything at the moment. It's been a while since the second novel came out. And I would quite like to have another novel out. I'm writing something at the moment, but it's not a full book. But if the opportunity ever presented itself, I would absolutely like to visit Tom Fool again and maybe finish his. I know his story finishes in a version of a Lake District village that's in really deep trouble, and gets trashed as a result of it. But that's as far as I've thought it, because there doesn't seem much point in spending time on thinking anything through until I've decided to write it, and I'm not writing it at the moment.
I hope you do, because I think that both books are brilliant, and the conceit is
I appreciate that. Thank you.
The conceit is one of those things that when you think, oh shit, I wish I'd thought of that. It's just such a brilliant idea, and the execution is brilliant. I genuinely think they're brilliant books, so I hope you do. We're going to take a break before we go into the third part, so I'm going to ask you about your films, your film choice, your book choice, and your TV or streaming choice. So we'll just take a short break. We're into the third part where I ask you about one film, one book, and one TV or streaming show. But just before we do that, it would be remiss of me not to have mentioned this because he asked me to. So I forgot to ask you about the fact that you actually co-authored a book with your son.
I did. Yeah, Ben is now a very good writer, and I say that without any kind of fatherly bias. His stories are excellent. He writes reviews of all sorts of stuff, which are really kind of good and insightful. Back when he was first starting writing, he was starting to write short stories, and I had published a number of years before four very early short stories. The only thing I've ever self-published. And I thought it might be nice, and it would absolutely, I say in the book itself, it's an act of greatest nepotism
Hmm.
to be able to go to my publisher, Steve Shaw at Blackshook Books, and say, how about you do one of your minis, three stories of Ben's. I'll help Ben get his stories into order. I didn't need to do that much to them really, and these four early ones of mine. And it's a nice thing. It's one writer at the beginning of hopefully the beginning of his career, and one writer who's fairly well established, sort of showing what his beginning of his career looked like. And we won't say whose stories are whose,
Hmm.
and we'll just see how people like it. And Steve, bless his heart, said yes. And we published it. And what's really nice about it is in the reviews, people have different favourites, and they're not always the ones that I wrote. So that faith I had that the stuff Ben was writing was good enough to be published was kind of borne out by the fact that people, in the reviews will say that there's a particular story that's their favourite and it's one of Ben's, not one of mine. And I find that kind of enormously gratifying. And I can't take any credit for what Ben does, but I can maybe take a small amount of credit for giving him the confidence to carry on, although I think he probably would have done anyway, to be fair.
Hmm.
Um, but it's a nice thing to have. It's a nice thing to have been able to do, and it's a nice thing to be able to look at and go, yeah, that's the only thing I've ever co-authored actually. So it's quite pleasant, really.
He was the first guest on the podcast, so he talked quite a bit about this, about the influence of you on what he was writing and just the influences generally, which was really nice to hear. I have his debut collection here. He will kill me if I
Yes,
don't try to slip it into the
he will.
into his dad's episode. He kind of like give me strict instructions that I had to
Yeah,
do.
no, that's understandable.
Yeah. Never misses a chance.
No,
Right. So, I would like to ask you about you mentioned John Carpenter before, Escape from New York. I think I've seen that film more than any other film, but what is your film choice? What film could you have on repeat, or you'd like to go back, or you do go back to it every year and watch it?
well, I do go back to it every year. It's really tempting in a thing like this is to try and find something that you think people won't know, so that you can kind of bring someone some new thing into their life, and
Exactly,
bring
yeah.
some love to something that's a bit maybe lesser known. But the bottom line here is the film I go back to time and time again is The Thing.
Oh,
It
wow.
is
Yeah, me too.
by far my favourite film. The only thing that even comes close is my love for Jaws, which
Hmm.
is it is. I never ever think that Jaws is my favourite film. It's always second to The Thing. But if The Thing didn't exist, it would clearly be Jaws. But it's The Thing, and it is a work of absolute beauty. There isn't a frame wasted in it, and I love every moment of it. Even the moments where I look at it and go, I can see that that's not quite what was intended. I can see that isn't
Hmm.
quite as good as it might have been. That's where some of the budget didn't work or whatever. I can see its faults and I can love them. I love it for those faults as much as for its innumerable good points.
I think a lot of people were, especially in the horror genre, would agree with you about that film being everybody's kind of like personal favorite or one of the personal favorites.
Yeah.
Um, how do you feel about the news that is leaking out at the moment that perhaps Carpenter might be doing an official sequel to this? He's kind of tentative about what he's saying, but people are quite excited by it. Do you think I don't know, his last two films, I think they even pissed him off, so he never directed for a long time. Do you think he could do a good job of it?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm really ambivalent about it. There's a part of me really wants to see it, especially if Carpenter is involved and it's based on his ideas. But there's a part of me thinks, maybe just leave it well alone. The part of the brilliance of the thing, I think, is that it doesn't give you any easy answers. It doesn't give you a resolution at the end. It gives you a situation in which the good guys haven't won, and that always appeals to me. People rarely come out of my stories and my fiction well. They no matter how hard they try, they end up in normally in a worse place than where they started. And I think the thing is a huge influence on me in that sense. That kind of notion that you can try as hard as you like, but life still sometimes kicks the shit out of you.
Hmm.
That your life is incredibly the life as not just physical life, but your social and economic and emotional life are incredibly fragile, and it only takes one bad minute for those things to become incredibly upset and incredibly devastated. So I have absolutely no doubt that if that film gets made, I will go to the cinema to see it, and I will buy
Yeah,
it
me
on
too.
Blu-ray. I'll
Yeah,
buy it on Blu-ray even if I don't like it.
yeah, yeah,
I was the same with the prequel. It was wasn't very keen on the idea, but couldn't not watch it. Couldn't not
yeah,
buy it when it came out.
yeah,
Couldn't. And I couldn't go in wanting it to fail. I went in wanting it to be a success, and I will do the same with the sequel if and when it ever appears. Um, but I don't. The other part of it is in my world that sequel should only be made with me writing it. That's the other part of this. There's always a
yeah,
certain amount of jealousy that they haven't come to me and said, look, we know you're a fan, we know you're a writer, do you fancy knocking a script together? To which the answer would be, yeah, go on, just this once.
yeah,
um so yeah, I'm tentatively sort of okay with it, but I also just, there is a big part of me thinks, no, just leave it alone. It stands as a masterpiece, and I kind of don't want to know what happened to Macready, but then I kind of do.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
a strange position to be in, honestly.
yeah. When I was a boy, when I first saw it, obviously I was very interested in seeing special effects that I
Yes.
didn't even know were possible. But as an adult watching it, I have this idea that you could take out the special effects, up the paranoia even more, and it would still work as equally well. But what do you think? Because Carpenter he's a bit of a curmudgeon when it comes to his idea of how a film should be made. So he's not a fan of things like the Cat People because he thinks that you never really get to see what you should see. So he's
Yeah.
always the door has to be open. You have to get your money's worth at the end. You have to see what it's like. I think there are many different ways of writing and making films, and I'm open to all of those so long as they're done well. Um, do you think this? Do you think this? Do you think the thing could work without the special effects, or do you think no, it's absolutely integral to what that film is about?
I think it could, but it would be a very different film.
Yeah.
I think the one of the reasons that Carpenter's The Thing is such a masterpiece is that you do get, and actually, if you watch it with a critical eye, the special effects take up very little of the runtime.
True.
Most of it is men talking to each other
Yeah,
and
that's
running
true.
around and flaming things. There's only 3 or 4 key scenes of properly over the top special effects,
Yeah.
and they're quite short.
Yes, true. Yeah.
But where it's brilliant, where it's utterly brilliant, where it is in fact completely untouchable, is that when those scenes happen, they are, particularly the first time you watch it, they are so unexpected and they are so spectacular that it lifts it lifts the rest of the film. The rest of the film is brilliant. It's a brilliantly made film. It's brilliantly photographed by Dean Cundy. It's script is occasionally confusing, but most of the time rattles along brilliantly. It's got fabulous acting in it, and then every now and again you'll get a head that turns into a spider thing, or you'll get a chest that opens and bites someone's arms off. And particularly watching it when it came out, I had never seen anything like it. I'd seen
Yeah.
American Werewolf and the Transformation, and that's astonishing. But to watch that film at the age of probably 12 or 11,
Yeah.
Those moments have never left me. That head sprouting legs and scuttling across the floor is a fucking world-beating piece of film. And I think the thing works because it's got that in, because it's got those huge sort of swathes of paranoia that suddenly bookend with something so grotesque and so in your face that you can't not look at it because
Hmm.
it is mesmerizing. And the blood test scene, it kind of accumulates to this incredibly tense moment of, we know it's going to happen, we know that something's going to happen, but Carpenter just, I don't know, he just makes it work. And you're right, he's a curmudgeon, and his last few films haven't been what I wanted them to be. He's made a number of films. I'm not a fan of vampires. I think it's kind of terribly right wing and rather unpleasant. I thought The Ward was okay, but for a run of
Yeah.
Elvis through to They Live, Carpenter just didn't put a foot wrong.
Hmm.
There is no other director, I think, who was so consistent from you know Elvis was great, but particularly Halloween. If you start Halloween and you track the Carpenter movies, he is untouchable. There's
Yep.
this run of movies where every movie is spectacularly brilliant in its own way. Escape from New York, the vision of that, and the terror in Halloween, and the eye popping brilliance of the thing, and it just, you should look at it. I'm not a filmmaker. I kind of wish I was in some ways, but I'm not. But I could see that if I was a filmmaker, even as a non-filmmaker, I am in absolute awe of John Carpenter, and that run of spectacularly good films that I revisit all of them. The
Yeah.
thing, I think, needs a re. I haven't watched it in about a year, so it needs a revisit. But I've watched Halloween again recently. I've watched Escape in New York recently. I've watched Prince of Darkness and The Fog, and I love all of them. But the thing is always the one I go back to. The thing is like my tomato soup movie. It's my comfort movie when I'm feeling miserable. It's the thing I can put on,
Yeah.
and every time it comes out in a new version, I'm like, oh well, it's out in 4K. I've got to buy a 4K version. So and if there's ever an 8K version, I've no doubt I'll have to buy an 8K player and the 8K version of the thing, and that will be my excuse.
I think the one thing that he has that most directors don't have is even if he screws up a film, which, as you say, it's not very often that he did that, he is the master of the beginning of an ending of a film. I can't
Yes,
think of many directors that can start the way he does and then end the way he does. Even his worst film, which is I think probably Ghost from Mars, even that has it's a rip-off of Escape from New York, I guess, in
it
many
is.
ways. But I still, just because it's him, I can overlook the flaws, as you say, and he's fantastic with the openings and endings, but I don't think any ending could probably of all his films, The Thing has the ending. And just one final note on that. Ennio Morricone, known for his very lavish scores, with a very I don't know, how would I describe that score? It's very low key compared to all his other work, and yet it's one of those that never gets put on his compilations because I've got a few, and I think that encapsulates the whole mood of that film
Yeah,
as well
I
as
agree
any
completely.
of his famous scores. So yeah,
Yeah, no,
even that,
I agree absolutely. I have the extended version of Morricone's soundtrack to the thing, and
yeah,
it is something I write to sometimes. I don't always write to soundtracks, but actually that's a good one to write to, and it's sparse, and there's that heartbeat that just runs through it, and it's fabulous. And you're right, Morricone scores for a fistful of dollars and a few dollars more, and the good, particularly the good, the bad, and the ugly. You know, how do you top the score to the good, the bad, and the ugly? Well, you keep being Ennio Morricone and you keep
yeah,
writing these magnificent scores. But then my assumption is that Carpenter sort of sat with him and went, essentially, I really want you to do a score, but I don't want it to sound like an Ennio Morricone score. And that
yeah,
alone must have been a brave choice to make.
yeah.
You hire the man who writes like you say, huge, opulent, strident scores, and then you tell him not to write anything huge, opulent, or strident. And
Yeah,
actually, he doesn't. He writes something, and I've always heard rumours that that's a lot of Carpenter in there as much as Morricone, but
yeah.
whoever it is that did it, they did a good bloody job.
I think he actually played him something. From where I was reading, he played Morricone something. He did it. Morricone was very. I'll do this quickly. When The Hateful Eight came out, Quentin Tarantino's movie, and I heard the outtakes from the original thing, which is what Tarantino used in part of his thing. I realized that The Hateful Eight is Tarantino's remake of the thing, and then I read about it later, and it was exactly that. But
Yeah.
Morricone later regretted letting him use them because he said that this guy just rips off everybody, and he ripped off John Carpenter, and well,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
what
let's
about
not
you?
let's not get into the Quentin Tarantino discussion. We could be here for hours.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's for another time. What about your favorite TV or streaming show? Do you have one?
Yeah, and this one is where I go slightly left field. There's a lot of TV that I like a lot. I could pick as a standalone piece of TV art. I could very easily pick Stephen Volk's Ghost Watch, which is
Yeah.
my favourite piece of supernatural television ever. I think it's magnificent, and I think it's a magnificent piece of work. But the thing I'm going to pick here is not horror, and I'm going to pick NYPD Blue in its entire
Oh
run,
wow.
which is for me as perfect a long form television sort of run gets. It has a lead character who is monumentally unsympathetic, but who you come to genuinely love.
Hmm.
It has side characters who never feel like ciphers or sort of hooks on which to hang stories. They always feel like sort of fully rounded people, to the point that you know, particularly Jimmy Smith in it, just it's just brilliant. I
Hmm.
I will qualify that by saying that the first series leaves a lot to be desired. It there's a lot in there that's good. No, there's a lot in there that's brilliant. But David Caruso kind of spoils it a bit, and some of it's a bit over the top. But by the time it hits its stride in series two, when Jimmy Smith turns up in series that's episode 5 of series two, it becomes something enormously special. And I've rewatched it the whole run. Discovering it on the Disney Plus channel a number of years ago was fabulous, and I've rewatched it as a whole thing twice in the last 3 years because I love it that much, and I love Dennis Francis Sipowicz. For me, is the
Hmm.
greatest television character ever. To play a man so deeply flawed and unpleasant and difficult and racist and sexist, and yet to be able to play him so that you actually like him, not for those things, but for the struggle that he goes through in trying to be a better man and trying to become, a dad and a husband. And in the middle of all this, solving the most awful crimes. And I've read David Milch's autobiography, and I've read stuff around it that a lot of the police stuff is based on, genuine police stories, because they brought police detectives in as consultants and stuff, so that has that reality to it. But at its heart, it is a story about one man trying desperately to be a better man, and I respond to that immensely, because if there's anything I've learned about myself is that I'm not perfect yet, and I like to think that I try most days to try and be a better man. But to look at Sipowicz is it's very hard to talk about it, because I don't quite know how to express how
Hmm.
much I love it without sounding like I'm either becoming a sycophant or that I'm just sort of blowing smoke up its ass. But it's so well written. The dialogue is like poetry. It's like and often there's a sort of a dialect almost that I don't recognise. I've never been to New York, so I have no idea if that's what New York sounds like. But the rhythm of the speech and the rhythm of Sipowicz and Jimmy Smith's characters talking to each other is just magnificent. If you haven't watched it, sign up to Disney Plus and go and watch it. Persevere through the first series, which is good, like I say, not brilliant, and then get into the second series and just roll with how fantastic it is.
Oh, I have watched it, yeah, but it was a long time ago. I remember it was on Channel 4.
Yeah,
It,
it
it,
was.
it,
It was.
it, it's often put in the top 10 TV shows. It was described as seismic because it changed I think the police procedural approach, I think forever after that, I think you had people probably inundating producers and, oh, I've got a gritty, edgy, people speak in a real way. Um,
Yeah.
how do you think it compares with other programs that are maybe not similar, but they obviously inspired by the whole way of writing that show?
There's a lot of them that I like. And I'm a big fan of crime TV, as my wife will attest. I watch an awful lot of cozy crime because I find it quite comforting. I'm a big fan of things like Death in Paradise and stuff, and I like the way those stories can be structured. I like the intelligence of setting up like locked room mysteries and finding a sensible resolution. No, not sensible. A working resolution. They are often not sensible in the slightest.
Yeah.
Um, I tried to watch Hill Street Blues after my last run through with NYPD Blue.
Hmm.
I remember watching Hill Street Blues sort of on and off when it was on when I was very young, and
Yeah,
I
me
went back
too.
and tried to watch it from the beginning, and I found it too noisy, and that's an odd thing to say, but I found Hill Street Blues, good though it was, it's not that it had too much going on, but it was too sort of fractured and noisy, whereas NYPD Blue kind of streamlined the focus. I think. I mean, it's just me. I mean, I'm sure people will be frothing at the mouth and disagreeing with me hearing me say that. In terms of stuff after that, I don't. I like my quite often. I like my drama quite glossy. NYPD Blue is a bit of an outlier for me in the sense of I don't often like things that are that realistic. I
Hmm.
sort of feel like I get quite enough of reality when I walk outside the house, outside the
Yeah.
door, and I quite like my drama to take me away from that, even if it takes me to a negative place. So NYPD Blue, like I say, is an outlier. It's one that I don't have a lot of comparators for it because it's not the sort of thing I normally watch. I tried to watch um I tried to watch The Wire, and I was enjoying it, but I've tried to watch The Sopranos, and again enjoyed it, but feel no particular urge to go back and carry on with it.
Hmm.
I'll happily
Yeah.
watch if there's nothing else on. I'll happily watch an episode and carry on with it. But they're not the things that usually grab me. So I have no idea what it is about NYPD, but maybe it was just at
Yeah.
the right time in my life, and it sank a hook in me. But it. And I'm not a TV critic. I'm not a film critic, as you'll no doubt have realised from my last 10-minute rambling. But I love NYPD Blue for what it is, and I love. I like Father Brown, and I like Death in Paradise, and I like Beyond Paradise, and I like all these other glossy, ridiculous programs that have no real basis in reality. But NYPD Blue remains comfort TV for me, which is an odd thing to say about a program that can be so utterly miserable and bleak. Babies eaten by dogs and the like. It's not a very nice program at times, but I could put an episode on right now and be perfectly happy to watch, and would probably end up watching the rest of the series.
Fantastic. And your one book choice?
Ah, I don't think anyone is going to be surprised when I tell you it's Salem's Lot.
Oh, fantastic.
Salem's Lot is my
Yeah.
favourite book ever.
Yeah.
Um, I
How
am
old were
a,
you, Simon? How old were you
a
when you first read it?
Christ. I must have been about 8.
Okay.
I have very clear recollections of this. The first episode of the TV show had been on,
Yeah, Toby.
and then we went on holiday. My mum and dad and sister and my friend went on a caravan holiday to Wales, and we were an early adopter of video recorders, so I had set it to record the second episode, but was panicking that it wouldn't. And the camp shop had a copy of the book, so I bought the book just in case the video didn't record the second episode. And started to read it while we were on that holiday, and I genuinely think I got through Salem's Lot in about 4 days in Wales,
Yeah.
and I've loved it to bits ever since. I love the fact that it can be, again, Salem's Lot is another one where I consider it to be a genuine piece of art. It takes its time. It unravels really slowly. It never rushes. It's never overwritten, never overstays its welcome the way some of the later King stuff does. Um, it's the perfect length. It goes the perfect pace. It has the perfect tone, and it can then explode into moments of sheer horror. And it's another one that I revisit. I revisit in audio. I actually really like listening to it in audio when I'm driving and stuff. But
Hmm.
most times, every couple of years, I will revisit Salem's Lot and reread it, because again, it reminds me what I love about the written word and the spoken word. It reminds me what I love about stories that take their time. The Salem's Lot, the town, is just as much of a character as Ben Mears and Mark Petrie
Yeah.
and Mr. Barlow and Mr. Straker. And I know that was a very deliberate thing that King did. I've read tons of interviews about it and listened to him talk about it. But for me, it's just one of those. And again, it's that thing about, I must have read it at the point where my head was ready to read Stephen King. I'd
Yeah.
read Carrie, but hadn't really associated with King. Salem's Lot, I read, and it's one of those books. It feels like it sort of it unfolds your head and opens your head up to this whole other world of possibilities, and that's what Salem's Lot did. It told me, it taught me that horror could be set in the real world. I realized it was America, and I'm not American, but I recognized that town.
Hmm.
And I was, prior to that, I remain a huge fan of M.R. James, but they were set in a different world. They were set
Yeah.
in a world that no longer exists, and I could see that the world in Salem's Lot was there. People were driving, people were talking about their jobs, people were, and I was only 8, so a lot of this, the nuance of it, and it is an incredibly nuanced book. And every time I read it or listen to it, I find something new in it. I find something that I've not quite noticed before. And that for me is the sign that is a sign of great art. Is that every time you visit it, there is something that makes you go, "Oh yeah, well, I've not
Hmm.
noticed that," or I maybe had noticed it, but I'd forgotten it in the overall picture. So yeah, so Salem's Lot, and I have the big hardback version that's got the deleted scenes or the amended scenes that his editor required him to change. And I'm absolutely with his editor on almost all of those. I think they were right to be changed. Um, and I can read it now, and Ben and I have had long discussions about this. How is it? How is it that Mr. Barlow gets into the Petrie's house because he's not invited? Uh,
Hmm. Oh,
so I can see that it has faults. I can see that it's not perfect, but I'm always reminded when I think that is that actually it's perfect to me. But and I there is a story that Persian rug makers, when they were the best rug makers in the world, would always deliberately put one incorrect stitch into the rug, because the only perfect thing in this world is God. And if you make
oh, yeah,
something that's
yeah, yeah.
perfect, you're kind of challenging God. So you deliberately put a fault in. Now, I don't think that's what King did for 1 minute.
Mm.
Ben has this theory, and I don't know whether this is something that King said or whether fans of King have said, but that Mr. Barlow manages it because he's so powerful he doesn't need to be invited. And I always go, Tobless. I think it's an error,
Yeah,
but it's an error that I like, because it shows me that King is still a man at this point learning his craft.
yeah,
And if
yeah,
King can make an error, I can make an error. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that I'm anything like as good as Stephen King, but it's kind of almost reassuring to know that there are these little things that people do make mistakes with, but they continue to be brilliant.
yeah.
And Salem's Lot, it's just brilliant.
What do I was going to say to you, because you mentioned audiobook. I don't listen to audiobooks. I think they're great. I just don't listen to them. But I do have two short stories that I listen to every year, which is E.F. Benson's The Room and the Tower and Stephen King's short story sequel, One for the Road, which is if
Yes.
you turn off the lights and just listen to those, I'm like, oh, that's
Yeah.
fantastic. That still really sends a chill up my spine. What do you
Oh yeah.
think of all the interconnecting parts of novels and short stories that tie into Salem's Lot? Because I love all that kind of thing. That world building, outer edge stuff for me is really, really, really good. What do you think of that kind of thing?
I love it. I think I like the kind of, the fact you can read one Stephen King book and realize that that there's connections to other books. I think there is a risk that can start to exclude people, and I think
Hmm.
I keep intending to reread the Dark Tower sequence, but then when you start to realize it, you start to think, well, but then that also means me rereading the Black Tower, because they're all interconnected in ways that I kind of almost don't want them to be. I
Yeah,
want them to stand alone. So I don't want to have to read the Dark Tower to get the full version of the talisman or whatever. Sorry. Um, but more power to him for doing it. It's it's a hell of a feat. Um, and it's really interesting. I've just read King Dragon by Joe Hill.
yeah,
And he's, there's a number of times in his books now. There's stuff in Nosferatu where he references his dad's works, and I like it. I think sometimes it can come across as a bit too in jokey.
yeah. I know
And
you.
I'm absolutely I'm all for fan service and putting things in for your long term fans and readers and watchers to see and to know that it's kind of aimed. It's to make them happy, as it were. Um, and I do versions of it. I keep revisiting Richard Nakata from Quiet Houses because I really like him.
Hmm.
Um, the only version of it I've ever properly done is the novel I'm working on at the moment is not a it's not a sort of a horror novel set in hell or anything like that, but there is a character called Mr. Tap in it, although it's very different to the Mr. Tap that's in The Devil's Evidence. But actually, in my head, they're the same person. They're just
Yeah,
in different visages. So I do like the interconnectedness, as long as it doesn't become exclusive of people who maybe haven't read it all, of which
yeah,
I am often one. Very often I come late to parties. It's a long time since I've read The Dark Tower. I'm not actually sure I read all of them. I think there might be a couple at the end that I just didn't get round to. So at some point I will try and reread those from the beginning, and that will probably make me well, in all honesty, I'm just started rereading The Talisman because I want to read that and Black House before
yeah,
there are more worlds than these, or whatever it's called, comes out in October, which I've already pre-ordered, but on Audible rather than in books, a paper book, simply because I realize I've always liked audiobooks and audio dramas and stuff. There's nothing better to me than knowing I've got a long car journey by myself, thinking,
yeah.
brilliant, that's 2 hours it's 2 hours of being read to that I can enjoy.
Fantastic, Simon. I'd like to thank you for being on the podcast today. This is the kind of thing that I hope that writers will talk about. I'm going to say the same thing that I say to a lot of guests. Is I could listen to the guests speak all day, and you're exactly the same. It's fascinating hearing about your insight into writing and to talk to you about your books. I wish I had more time to talk to you about your books, because I wanted to ask you about the Pennine Restaurant Tower story. But another day, another day. I know you're
Yeah.
on a schedule today. Thank you very much, Simon, for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been genuinely a pleasure. And it's like I said at the beginning, it's nice to know that people are actually still, reading my stuff, and that I haven't sort of vanished into the ether, because I'm aware that I've not published a lot recently. So
Oh no,
it's nice to have people still talking about the stuff that I have already done. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I have really enjoyed it.
thank you, Simon. Have a very nice day.
You too. You too.
Thanks, Simon.